Professor Juliette Kayyem is an international leader in crisis management and homeland security. She serves as the faculty chair of the Homeland Security and Security and Global Health Projects at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Previously, she served as President Obama's Assistant Secretary at the Department of Homeland Security and as Mass Governor Deval Patrick's Homeland Security Advisor. She's also the CEO of GRIP Mobility, a technology security company in the mobility space. A CNN national security analyst, Pulitzer Prize finalist, and recently promoted to
contributing writer
to The Atlantic and Boston's local NPR station, WGBH. Kayyem also advises governors, mayors, and corporations on crisis management. She's the author of 6 books, including the most recent, The Devil Never Sleeps, Learning to Live in an Age of Disasters. Juliette lives in Cambridge with her husband, Judge David Barron, and her 3 children. Welcome to Juliette.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here. You're all crazy, it's freezing. I was like, I watched by video, but I thank you for getting out in this weather, which we will be talking a lot about weather. I'm going to use some PowerPoints just as a prompt. I'm going to use the book sort of as a prompt and talk to you a little bit about where we are in terms of disaster management and crisis management. I say we purposefully because, as you all know, having lived through the last couple of years, we all are crisis managers now. And this book really, it's, you know, when you're in a field, you sort of, there's that one book that you always want to write. COVID actually sort of gave me the time to write it because I tend to travel a lot and was at home. I think reflects where my profession is and where people in my space are right now, or how they're thinking about it, which may be helpful to you as well in terms of how the disaster management, crisis management, when and if it works, really does. I thought I would end with some current events around the mass shooting in California and of course Memphis. I'm always like a good news person, but maybe give you some thoughts about how I think those reflect some of the issues, and then happy to take any current events questions and answers at the end. I want to tell you how this book starts because many of you I hear live in Cambridge as well. And like many of you, I have a very old and what I call cranky house. It was built in 1820. I live in Central Square, and has had many iterations. It was a boarding house, a guest house, a split house, a 3-level, whatever. But the people that we bought it from had made it into a single family home. And like many homes in Cambridge, and I'm so glad of this audience because sometimes it's hard to explain this to people. There's lots of nooks and crannies in these homes and walls like for no reason, and you're like, what is behind there? And so when we moved in, it's a 3-story house with a basement. On the 3rd floor, there's my daughter's room was and a guest room, and there's a closet with just a wall behind it. And we were told that there was a crawl space behind this closet, and I'm not gonna like guess crawl spaces, that seemed fine. And this crawl space is the ceiling of my teenage son's bathroom. So fast forward, we've been there about 12 years and no one makes much of this alleged crawl space. I can't see it, it's blocked by a wall. And COVID happens. And like many of you, we were stuck inside. The difference for me is being in this space, for those of you who watch CNN or read The Atlantic and stuff, I mean, my professional life was really crazy, but doing it all from home, and one daughter comes home from college, and 2 kids who are at CRLS are home, and the boys have a bathroom, and the fan breaks in the bathroom, and they decide not to tell me and continue to take the showers that teenage boys take. And all of a sudden I wake up one day and the ceiling, all the plaster has fallen. Why I don't know what they were thinking, but they go, oh yeah, the fan broke like 2 weeks ago. I was like, okay, thank you. And so the plaster comes down and it exposes what we had been told was the the crawl space. This is the intro to my book, this whole story. This crawl space is a little bit bigger than a crawl space. It's about 10 feet by 4 feet. And there's two things in it, a book that is sort of destroyed like a dictionary and a picture. That picture is of a gentleman, those of you who know sort of early 20th century pictures, he's very elegant, he's leaning against a wall, it's got the red tint, and it just says, "To Annie," and that's it. So call it boredom, call it what's going on here. I decide I'm a big social media person, and on Twitter, I put it on Twitter where a lot of people who do this stuff and like this stuff, I said, hey, this was found in my thing, can anyone date this, whatever. Well, people did more than date it. They found out where I lived, I guess that's easy to do, and put two and two together. So I go to bed that night with information, and the way Twitter works is people are just tagging me and saying, hey, this is so-and-so, your house was this. That Annie is Annie McHugh, who lived in the house the McHugh family lived in the house from 1917 to 1920. The McHughs were a well-known family. We are friends with President and Governor at the time, who would become McKinley. He's very involved with the high school, CRLS, which had a different name, Cambridge Regional Light, which had a different name at the time. And they had two children. The son had died when he was 10, well before they moved into the house, and they had a daughter named Letitia. I go to bed thinking this is interesting and not much of it, because like many of you, our houses have a lot of history. And I wake up the next morning. I am a little bit freaked out, and I lock the door to the bathroom when I go to bed. And my husband's like, okay, you're like a disaster management person, you're afraid of ghosts? I was like, I don't know, it's just weird. And the next morning I wake up to a lot more information that people have found online or whatever, that the McHughs had lived there with their daughter from 1917 to 1920. Their daughter Letitia lived to the age of 19, that was the age of my daughter at the time, and had died in the home, in this room that was a crawl space, but many of you know this about your homes possibly, that they had sick or infirmity rooms. They were also birthing rooms where someone would go if they were sick to isolate them. Fast forward, and we learn from her death certificate that she died in the third wave of the Spanish flu, which came into Cambridge really strong, I would later learn, in the third wave, that Cambridge was very much impacted by the Spanish flu then. The McHughs would soon move out. Letitia died on that top floor. The funeral was in my home. This obviously caused a lot of thinking about my home, and this home I thought I knew, the weirdness of it, but also the connectivity of the experience I was having with this mother, Annie at the time, who also was trying to protect her daughter from a flu that she probably knew a lot less about. Annie would live to the 1960s here in Cambridge. She died a widow, having lost both children, the home would be boarded up. They moved out, and that room would be boarded up. That was the crawl space. And it got me thinking about the connectivity of the harms that we face and the disasters. And the book I had been thinking of for all of my career, that we tend to think of disasters as random and rare, and these crises are sort of coming, like blips, how could that happen, or how could that happen, or it's always happening, but we always sort of viewed them as sort of separate and isolated. And what if I could study and write about all these disasters that I knew, all of these from the Trojan horse to I get as far as Surfside, Florida in the book, and how can I find the connective tissue to help to provide to audiences and readers what is the similarities, what can we learn from that moment of that boom, right? The moment that Letitia gets sick, that moment when the hurricane comes, or the tornado, or the terrorist, or whatever it is, rather than thinking about this threat or that threat. So I wanted to kind of turn it all on its head and say, look, there's something, we're human beings, we have agency. If we can find the connective tissue amongst all these things, maybe that's the connection between me and the McHugh family in this home, and two mothers trying to protect their 19-year-old daughters, which ended up being that connective tissue. So this is the book that I write. So this is my field, and that story that will maybe, all of you are going to go back to your homes and your crawl spaces now, I know. Like, what, they told us it was just a closet. And thinking about those similarities. So I'm going to just go through what my field is like and what that connective tissue is. I'm going to tell a lot of stories from disaster management, and also so you understand. So we're very simple people. We think about the world into only two phases, right and left of boom. And I am very clear here in the way I teach it, and the way, if those of you watch me on CNN or whatever, like the way I talk about it is like, that boom could be anything. I'm not a cyber expert. I came up through counterterrorism. I was a counterterrorism lawyer and a policy person well into 2003, 2004. But now we just think about it, the boom. So we're agnostic about the boom. It's just that moment. It's the devil. It's the devil never sleeps, right? It is that moment. Right of left of boom are all the things that you do to try to stop the bad thing from happening, and right of boom are all the things that you do as the bad thing is happening. So we tend to think of success and failure as, right, and just think about the way you think. Success is left of boom, I keep all the bad things from happening, and failure is right of boom. The bad thing happened, the devil came. And that seemed like a very bad way to think about a world in which you really weren't going to stop all booms. How can I measure success? You know, that's what I like to do. I'm at a school of public policy. How do I measure success in an age where I'm not going to be able to stop the devil every time? And the idea of the devil never sleeps came to me as I was, doing this from Joplin, Missouri. Many of you, so I'm going to take you through a whirlwind of disasters. Joplin, Missouri is a small community, God-fearing Republican, about as different from the Obama administration as you can imagine. It has a tornado come through it. If those of you who know tornadoes, we have a very not nice name for them that starts with B. They are horrible because there's very little warning. And the way tornadoes work is if you were on 19th Street in Joplin, Missouri, chances are you were dead. If you were on 18th or 20th, you were fine. It just plows through. So Joplin loses over 100 people in 22 seconds. Just like that. And any of you who've experienced tornadoes know that even earthquakes give a little bit more time. People can react. Joplin is devastated. This isn't a 9/11 equivalent for this town, and we're in the Obama administration. We come in. There's, in this way, disasters do often merge all the divides in our country. In my weird world that I live in, I'm often invited back, right? So it's not said. I was invited back to the Joplin, Missouri anniversary one year, and these anniversaries are weird, but communities do it, right? They want to show that they've moved on, Joplin strong, and they have a parade, and the Weather Channel's there and everything, and the recovery is being led by a widow named Jane Cage. Jane has decided to take on her community in a way that she wanted it to be better prepared for the next tornado, and she is. I loved her faith in the sense that she, devoutly Christian, but her faith was not one of resignation. It was one of God put us on this earth for a reason, right? And it was one of agency and empowerment and tactical. And she had gone around Joplin with her little sticky notes asking people, what could we do better, sirens, whatever. And I said, how are you like this? This is most people would not have this, or a lot of people would not have this kind of faith or enthusiasm or optimism about what her community could be. And she says, Juliette, I live in Missouri. There will be more tornadoes. The devil never sleeps, but the next part is where we are, but he only wins if we don't do better next time. And that's the way we think about it now, right? In terms of these recurring, not random, not rare, right, disasters, that you're just constantly in a cycle of left and right and boom, an infinity cycle. I don't say this because I like it, right? I just say it because I look at the world, and it's hard for me to say otherwise, right? This would be a nice world where it's no, we're constantly facing these disasters. So how do we measure success when this is our challenge? And so my very technical term for it, and the theme throughout the book, is less bad. right? That's your measure of success. A COVID pandemic that kills 1.2 or however many we're gonna get Americans, and one that kills 400,000, which was sort of our outer limit at the beginning, before everything happened. The 400,000 is not good, my God, no, right? But it's less bad than your 1.2. What did we fail at the boom, right? At that moment, what did we lose in January, February, March of 2020? What did we not prepare for? But also, what did we lose both before the vaccine and after the vaccine is available? So this is how less bad, right? If I'm ready for that, if I anticipate and know that boom is coming rather than the surprise factor, what can I learn from centuries of disasters? I'm going to go through some of those lessons, not all of them. So this is a wonky slide, but basically any of you who have been or worked in the field of insurance or risk management or whatever you do, we worry about high consequence, high probability events. That's your corner, right? They're called the gray rhino in the literature. They're like always there and looming. Some of you will be familiar with the terminology, the Black Swan, a famous book that was written, which is your low probability, high consequence events. Think of 9/11, although that's debatable. But basically, could we just think about a world in which your consequences were really high? And that's a world I'm worried about. I'm gonna stop worrying about stopping the devil here and stopping the devil there. Okay, I'm happy that people are trying to do that, but if I'm not prepared for the boom, right, everything is gonna be high consequence. So my measure of success is gonna be less bad, right? Can I make the catastrophe merely a disaster? And that's how we will judge success in many ways. I don't wanna say it's perverse, it is just reality, and this is the world I live in. It's like someone said, I don't live in some article written about me in the New Yorker said, I don't live in the world of unicorns and rainbows, but I'm incredibly optimistic. So both of those things can go together, but I'm not gonna wish for a world that I can't achieve. So like a gun shooting, whatever. Yes, I wish for a world in which we have more responsible gun ownership and responsible gun laws. I can't wish for that world at the moment of the active shooter. So basically then, just to tell you, what are the things I don't worry about? I don't worry about the low consequence, low probability events, otherwise known as the selfie stick deaths. Every year, a couple dozen people die, or our kids or grandkids are into Instagram and they decide getting that lean over the Grand Canyon is a really good idea. These are not happy events, but they are low probability, low consequence events. You're not gonna worry about them. You put up a sign, hopefully people will listen, but you're not gonna worry about them that much. So that is where we are in terms of our preparedness. So if my measure of success can be less bad, then I can't keep the boom from coming, but I can make the disaster less of one. And I thought this was just the way I think now. It's like, this is actually helpful, and in some ways it gets me out of the burden of the word itself, disaster. I had never looked up the word that I live in. I live in the crisis disaster management world. And disaster, actually, it turns out, comes from the prefix dis, the Latin prefix dis for not, and aster of the stars, right? That seems kind of obvious, right? Once you actually think about it. And the idea was that these bad things that were happening on Earth were a misalignment of the stars, right? Like star-crossed lovers, right? That this is, mankind was and humankind was in a passive position as the stars misaligned, and whoa, that's too bad. We can't, we can't anticipate it, and it's just our luck, right? It's just a luck. There's no such thing as luck, right? Because you can manage the harms even in the disaster. And so how could we get out of this, the paradox challenge? And the challenge is, of course, the better you do in disaster management, the less bad things are. The harder it is to get people to understand the benefits of preparing for the boom, because they'll say you were just freaking out, right? This is what's known in my world in the literature as the preparedness paradox. It comes out of public health, but many of you will remember it with Y2K, right? Remember Y2K, 1998, 1999, everyone is freaking out. The computers are gonna, go nutso when the clock turns to the new century. Planes are gonna fall out of the sky, you won't be able to get your money. And I'm sure many of you did react in certain ways, like did you have access to things? Lots of hoopla. What was also going on was a tremendous amount of preparation for a moment that you knew was gonna happen. And you actually, in this case, you knew exactly when it was gonna happen. And on December 31st. A couple $2 billion were spent just in the US alone, and there was a whole global effort to get the computers ready to respond to the new century, to remind people the computers were so relatively new that they had been triggered to 1.9, like as if 2000 would never come, right? So they were 1.9, so these computer systems, we didn't know what was gonna happen when it flipped. Was it gonna go to 00, or was it gonna, they were literally triggered to only 1 century. People party that night, wake up the next morning. There were blips, there's no question about it. There were problems in various states, some banking stuff, some countries weren't as ready as others, but the planes didn't fall out of the sky. You could go and get your money still. Like the catastrophe didn't happen. Well, first story, 3 days later, January 4th, 2000, what was everyone freaking out about, right? Because the harm didn't come. And this is the challenge of this is what we call the preparedness paradox. The better that my people, the boom people, right? The devil people, the right side of the devil people are, the harder it is to justify the investments. And so the only way to do it is to just view the devil or boom or come over it as recurring. Okay, so what does that mean? The devil never sleeps is, as I said, agnostic, and it tries to teach readers and people, this is what I do in talking and training and everything else, hold on, how to fail safer. That's where we are. Can we fail safer? This should be empowering, right? Because we're gonna acknowledge the failure, but the most important thing is, I use my terminology very carefully, it's not fail safe. A fail-safe is something that actually stops a bad thing from happening. What I'm trying to do is teach us how to fail safer, right? So that my measure of success is, it could have been worse. And that's, like less bad ends up being a good place to be when you look at the harms that will come. So I'm gonna now go through some of these lessons. These are the chapter titles. I want to open it up to questions in about 15 minutes. So let me go through some of these. Okay, so the first is Fukushima. Many of you will remember Fukushima. Okay, and what I do is I try to go back and find out what actually happened. Because we have a narrative about Fukushima, like we do Y2K, like we do COVID. We have these narratives, like how true is it? So Fukushima happens in 2011. You remember 3.3, their sort of doomsday, largest earthquake measured, over 10.0. Leads to a tsunami, leads to a nuclear meltdown at Fukushima. And we kind of blame it on the earthquake, which we can't control, or the tsunami, which we can't control. So let me tell you a story about Japan and nuclear power, because what you have to remember is the extent to which Fukushima really did change how we talk about nuclear power. And I think in a really bad way. I'm a proponent of trying to diversify our clean energy, and I think nuclear is part of it. What happened, or our narrative about Fukushima, is that nuclear power is unsafe, period. And the Democratic Party here, for example, became very, very anti-nuclear, and it's just starting to change in terms of what they're thinking about, or what that party's thinking about. Germany, and this has consequences today, completely abandons nuclear power and becomes completely dependent on Russian imports, which strikes me as not a great thing, or at least they're learning otherwise. Germany has actually, since the Ukraine war, switched their opinion on this, and is going to continue their nuclear program, or their access to nuclear energy. But all of this came out of Fukushima, which is, these things are dangerous, you can't stop the bad thing from happening. And then once it happens, catastrophe. Remember, about 50,000 people had to be evacuated immediately. We don't know how many deaths there were related to the nuclear facility itself. We know alone 60 suicides occurred of people who had been evacuated, and the company called TEPCO was held responsible for those suicides as if they had actually died from the nuclear meltdown because people were just had to abandon their homes in like 5 minutes. And the mental disaster was sometimes as great as we've seen as the physical disaster. Okay, so that's Fukushima, and we think that's our story. Let me take you 30 miles down the street to Onagawa, another nuclear facility. I bet you most of you have never heard that there was another nuclear facility down the street that failed safely. Now remember, Japan is the only, Japan is the only country that has been attacked by nuclear wars. It's got nuclear weapons. It's got a complicated relationship, I think it's safe to say, with the nuclear industry because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So when they start in Japan in the 60s and 70s, they start pushing nuclear energy because they have no other source of energy. They sell it to their communities as, well, it's safe. Not a good way to sell something, because what does that do? That makes communities unprepared, employees unprepared, companies unprepared. We know nuclear is not safe. There's ways to fail safer if something were to happen. TEPCO, that owns Fukushima, takes this arrogant attitude, it's the largest nuclear company in Japan, and basically builds nuclear facilities in ways that are just the assumption that this is going to be safe, including building Fukushima essentially on a fault line. In fact, when you read the book, you'll see a picture. If you read the book, you'll see a picture. Above Fukushima are messages written in stone by predecessors saying, do not build below this line, because this is where the tsunamis come. People who had experienced with tsunamis before, well, they built a nuclear facility there. The other nuclear facility down the street is owned by a smaller company, and its president and CEO had been trained in the United States about nuclear weapons, nuclear plants, and knew that these are not safe. He had trained his people to be prepared, essentially, to be able to turn off the nuclear facility, and he empowered them for what we call, what would be called false positives. In other words, at the operational level, if you are feeling that hair on your back, just do it. Just do it, right? I mean, this is now whatever. So both facilities lose concrete. They're actually both harmed by the earthquake. The earthquake is that strong, right? So both see rushing water. Fukushima, which is unprepared for how to do this, is calling Tokyo. You got 6 to 10 minutes to get this thing turned off. Is calling Tokyo. Things are so frenetic that at one stage the Prime Minister of Japan is on one of the phone calls. When you have the Prime Minister on the phone call, it's like over. Down the street, which is a facility I'm guessing most of you had never heard of, the guys who had been trained, the guys and gals who had been trained, see the water rushing in, turn it off 6 minutes, no radiation leak. Both facilities continue to be closed. So if I'm looking at my less bad standard, earthquake, tsunami, nuclear facility that is damaged, radiation leak, I'm choosing, or not, I'm choosing the one not, right? I can't make everything safe. It's a high risk industry. I can make it safer. So I also say about my book, if there's nothing else, you'll get good cocktail chatter. So that's what you now know about Fukushima, because there was another facility. So if we can look at the good news stories, which we never tell because Fukushima obviously is the story, what can we learn, right? That training, that preparedness, but the false positive, letting people make a judgment call in real time. And we see that, I actually think that is Uvalde's. We can talk about Uvalde, but I think, I just, hundreds of people not challenging the incident command, what is going on there. And it is this sense that, not empowering people to say, this is a horror, we're gonna overrule you. Okay, China's zero COVID policy. So what we learned, obviously, is it was crazy, right? I mean, they're locked up for longer periods. There's a whole theory about why China locked down. They did not want to admit how weak their own vaccine was, but they didn't want to import Western vaccines because, of course, they can't admit that the United States does this better than they did. And so they essentially locked down their entire country, right? It's just completely locked down. what they begin to experience is what you all experienced, I'm guessing, which is some risk calculation that brought you here today, right? And now you're masked, so you're offsetting your risk calculation, but you are not going for safe, which was how China was trying to sell it. You're just going for safer. You know there's much more risk being here than if you were at home, and you're just making that calculation. We made that every day, or those of us who were pushing to get schools open were saying, okay, well, when you don't have a vaccine, I get it. But now if you tell me, oh, will my kid be safer at home? Yes, but anyone who had kids at home also knew what was not being calculated into that was this is really bad for our kids, really bad. And any of you who are around, my kids had all the benefits in the world, and I feel like they're sort of 2 years behind on emotional development. I mean, and then my kids had every benefit in the world, but you just sort of like this window that they sort of lost, right? And one of my kids graduated from high school, behind a screen. So these moments, right? So that the risk calculation was going on here because of the vaccine, China started to bump up against. And how did they bump up against it? So what, in terms of what you're doing in terms of balancing? So what can I learn from this at the moment of boom? That safer becomes my model rather than safe, because safe is not going to be sustainable. Just in an ironic twist of what happened to China and I have a couple more before I get to the next one, in an ironic twist of what happened in China, what pushed the Chinese government to move wasn't, knowledge of a better vaccine or whatever else. It was the World Cup. We call it the World Cup moment, right? In other words, the Chinese citizens were watching the World Cup, people unmasked, having a great time, partying. Those protests against the zero COVID policy started the first week of the World Cup, and there's no question that there was a relationship between the two. So risk balancing. Okay, Hurricane Ian. Any of you spend time in Florida? My guess is some people probably do. Yes. Why are you here? I'm joking. But go now. Go before Saturday, I'm telling you. That is going to be a doozy. I'm like looking at my dog right now. I'm like, get it all out now, because that 0 degrees is not going to be fun. Okay, so Hurricane Ian. So one of the things is you'll see, these words can be strong, but one of the connective tissue that I talk about is listening to the dead. Why is that important? Why is it important to get a study of Uvalde or to get a study of COVID? How did people die? Right, that matters, because in a disaster, people will die. And I talk in terms of death, but there's destruction. At corporations, I talk about corporate reputation or the bottom line. Everyone's going to have how they define bad, but disasters tend to be where my space is. And so we often say in the lessons of our time are written on the tombstones, right? That's why do we listen to the dead? And it matters why people die. Because that they die is a given, but how they die, that's different. And one of the reasons why we study disasters and death, so to speak, is because people die for reasons that are not always obvious at the moment when the bad thing happens. So I could tell you a blizzard, the famous blizzard of 76 here, 76, Dukakis. 78, right? 100 people died. So we say in that blizzard, 100 people died. Well, let's go back. 87 of them died of carbon monoxide poisoning in their cars. People tend not to die. When a blizzard call comes, people tend to know what to do, right? And people die of heart attacks and whatever else. So what does that tell me if I'm in charge of transportation? And this is what you all experience now. If you're a governor, you're going to close the streets earlier than the certainty of the blizzard, because you can save life. That's how people die in blizzards. They tend not to die. So how people die matters. Listen to the dead, they're telling you. And so we have far fewer carbon monoxide deaths, obviously, from blizzards than we once had. Fast forward to hurricanes. We have gotten really good since Hurricane Katrina in terms of evacuations and the calling of evacuations. For 5 years leading up to Hurricane Ian, and I want to respectfully put Hurricane Maria to the aside. There were tremendous deaths. We actually still don't know how many deaths in Puerto Rico, but in the continental United States, for the 5 years before Hurricane Ian, not a single person died of water or drowning in a hurricane in the United States. There were hurricane deaths, but looking back at them, all of them were carbon monoxide related. People didn't have their energy, they didn't have their supply, and their generators were falling, they were too close to the house, like whatever it was. So you could think from an emergency management, disaster management perspective, I'm thinking about that boom, the hurricane's coming, what do you want to do? You want to educate people, yes, still evacuate, yes, still shelter in place, but also that other thing that you're doing, be careful on that. So I bring this up because how do I know that Hurricane Ian was bad in terms of its disaster management response? Because if a couple people, actually over 60 or 70, I don't know if we have the exact number yet, died in Hurricane Ian, that's a horrible number, but it's not, that can happen at such a big hurricane. So you go back and you study the dead and you listen to the dead, and what are they telling you? All of them were over 60 years old and they all died from drowning. Right? So compare that to the last 5 years. And they all died, I guess the third piece is in Lee County. Lee County famously, so those of you who follow this, famously did not follow its own evacuation orders for whatever reason. It second-guessed its own evacuation orders. Every other county is evacuating. So by the time they realize Hurricane Ian is real, you cannot evacuate the elderly people. And they drowned. Right, so this is what, so now what is this telling me in terms of my lesson learned is, right, one is often the plans are good, but two, if you don't call it early, your population that's going to be impacted is not the population that can jump into cars, it's the people who actually need help. Right? And these are the lessons that we can get out of each disaster. I'm not minimizing the harm. I tend not to be a blame person because I leave that for the politics and everything else, but it's a way to look at disasters differently and say, okay, the devil never sleeps, but he only wins if we don't do better next time, right? Because we got good at hurricane evacuations. Everyone was dying for other reasons. Okay, so I want to just end with what's at the front of the news. And two major incidents that sort of, I want to say, are sort of like the buttressing of the week and what's happening in my space. And I wrote 2 pieces for The Atlantic, one on each. So 10 days ago, you had the Lunar New Year killing. Everyone thought originally it might be a hate crime. I'll get into a gun, I'm happy to get into a gun control conversation or agree with most of you on that. But these deaths are causing a very uncomfortable but important conversation in my field. After Columbine, after the high school killings in Columbine, the idea of run, hide, fight became the mantra for active shooter cases. And remember, Columbine was not just a school shooting, it was really the first sort of mass shooting in the United States like that. And we copied what Israel had learned from their experience, which is when you have a situation like that, run if you can, hide if there's a place, and fight only if you must as a last resort. And how we got to that was because in Columbine, which no one had experienced it before, they had told all the kids to go into remember the library, and that was where most of the killings happened because they were hiding there, and the two killers went after them there. So I'm listening to the dead, right? And you're thinking, okay, so what can I do if I can't stop the active shooter? So run, fight, hide becomes the mantra, not just for our kids and school shootings, which are a little bit different, but for also society. And hiding, though, then I'll just admit, hiding becomes a little bit more questionable as a way to educate people. Fast forward to the Pulse killing 2 decades later, a gay bar in Florida, and most of the men were killed in the bathroom hiding there, right? This idea. And so what had changed, one of the chapters is called The Way We Were, right? You cannot rely on what you had before because these threats are changing, was of course the capacity of these guns to kill, or people to get guns that kill, I should be clear, very quickly. Most mass shootings end within 2 minutes. 50% of them end before law enforcement can arrive. And so the data is now suggesting that fighting can work. I'm not saying it's for everyone. I'm not saying it's even for my kids. But what we're starting to see is engagement to distract, delay, diffuse the threat. From Club Q to what happened at Lunar and a couple other incidents, again, the engagement is distracting. And all you're trying to do in an active shooter case, active shooter situation that happens so fast, is you're kind of trying to make things less bad, right? Can I get from 20 deaths to 10? I know it's a horrible, but this is the way my world is thinking, because what we want to do is, of course, educate people. And it's not for everyone, trust me, right? I mean, Club Q, the guy who engaged the shooter, was an Army vet, right? At the Chinatown event in California, it was a 22-year-old. You know, there's a lot of people with not those two benefits, but nonetheless something that we are beginning to think about and reassessing run, hide, fight for a world in which we have not dealt with the reality and the absurdity that we have guns that can kill 10 people in 2 minutes, right? You know, whatever your public safety response is, forget Uvalde. Whatever your perfect public safety response is, it's too late, right? So this is uncomfortable, but something, and it's not a good guy with a gun. None of these tend to be gun cases. They're just, you just want to distract the guy, right? So that someone else can come around and bop them on the head or whatever, right? It's 1 against 30 or 40 or 50. I want to fast forward to Memphis, though, and end with this. If you watch CNN, I tend to be on for bad news. I was put on hold for CNN, oh my God, 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. Because when we knew that the Memphis video was going to come out, we were worried about the things that happen often after these videos come out. Remember Rodney King, when the verdict came down, that wasn't a video, but Rodney King was the video, but when the verdict came down and the LA riots began, 63 people died, not because of police violence, right? You need to capture that energy, that righteous energy against police brutality. My God, we have a case here in Cambridge, or a police shooting case here in Cambridge, where you can manage that anger and that righteousness by a community that could not save one of its children from the people who are paid by us to protect him. So why wasn't there the kind of riots we saw? So I'll just end with this, and these are just my reflections, 4 days old, which is Memphis really did take seriously the idea that the secondary and third impact of an event like that had to be managed much better, certainly, than the incident itself or the original stop itself, which was clearly, I think, unjustified. First of all, they fired the police before anyone forced them to. Right? I mean, think about that. Normally what happens is the video comes out and then people go, you know, no justice, no peace, right? When people in Memphis were yelling no justice, no peace, it kind of seemed dated, right? Because these guys are already fired, another 4 are fired or suspended since. The second is they set the floor very low for us in terms of what to anticipate. I don't know how many of you really did want to watch it after hearing what it was. It was a snuff film. I had to watch it because I was on air. It was horrific. I knew it's horror. And so they had even prepared me, someone who's supposed to be flat-faced, you know, about how bad it would be. So it was like a proverbial body blow, but it was an anticipated one. And I think that did take some of the energy out of that anger in a good way, because you want to protect, these communities want to protect themselves as well. And the third is, of course, giving us time to think about when the release was going to happen. Those of you who follow Boston and Cambridge, I'm like on every alert system, you know, we were ratcheted up in anticipation. There were scheduled rallies around our communities, but also police understood engagement was probably a bad idea. Let people, you know, be who they are, and then move on. So this is sort of, these are early days, but this is sort of what we can learn, because God, you know, we know that there's going to be more police misconduct cases. And if we can minimize the harm after, things are less bad. So we can, in the end, learn to fail safer in a world that's certainly not ideal, and then just begin to view this standard of less bad as good. or better than the alternative. So thank you very much for listening to all my disasters, but I really appreciate your time, and I have about 15 minutes for questions, or 13. Thank you. I'll turn this off. Okay, we'll do the boom. Hi. Yes.
The reason that they did not release until after 6 p.m. is part of what we're talking about. Okay. I was really concerned with the Friday 6 p.m. release in really warm temperature, which it was. I'm a weirdo, so I look at the temperature, because you're not going to have a massive rally on Saturday at 0 degrees. Hasty Pudding, those of you know, the Hasty Pudding has a parade on Saturday. I'm like, yeah, crazy. But so the weather was good. It was a Friday night. People don't work on Saturdays. People tend to party on Friday nights. And I was like, what are they thinking? In reality, there were a couple of reasons. One was you would just have more police support on a Friday night because their staffing tends to be up. But more importantly was the 36 hours. They had given us 36 hours to when they were going to release it. So every police department was ready. You saw every mayor was making a statement. Everyone was ready. And I should say, it's not just the police or local authorities. That the family in Memphis was unbelievable, and community leaders were unbelievable. That what happened to him could not things would be less bad if there was no harm after the release. And the video is like nothing I've ever seen. It was true. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. It was worse than Rodney King, who did not die, remember.
Sometimes.
Yes, hi.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
Sometimes they're slow-moving booms.
Yes.
There are things you can see that are going to happen, and they happen.
Yeah.
Like this morning I was listening to the daily read from the Daily last podcast on Sunday about the Amazon rainforest.
Yes.
And it is a boom that's going to be happening. That is a disaster that we probably can't avert at this point. It's really horrifying to think about. We're all older people, as you can tell by looking at it. Young at heart, though.
You're my kind of crowd. Anyone can call me kid. It's like at 53.
It's so difficult to be this age
Yeah.
and wanting to make a difference still
Yeah.
in our lives with what's going on around us, instead of sitting around
I know.
watching the news, feeling hopeless, thinking, boy, I wish I was young and could do something about
Right.
this. What do you say to this group?
Oh, that's so great. Yeah, so there's a couple things. So first of all, I appreciate the slow moving boom. I understand it. And if this, I don't mean to not answer your question. I want to say, how do I think about the difference between a crisis and I teach at a school of public policy, and a public policy challenge, right? So how do we define a crisis? So in the literature, the way I think about it, or the way that how is it different from your standard operating procedure, is it is a disruption, often unanticipated as to time and place, that disrupts the core of the institution. So whether it's January 6th in our democracy, or it's the nuclear facility, or even I teach at the Kennedy School, this whole Ken Roth controversy. I mean, that to me is a crisis. And the reason why is the third piece is your response time is fast. And I don't mean to look. We've got climate change. It's here in the form of hurricanes, in the form of sea level, and that's the world I live in, the hurricane, the tornado, whatever. You've also got a public policy challenge. How do you mitigate all the left of boom stuff? And those are answered by different people than me, right? I mean, in other words, those are the smart scientists who are figuring out solutions. So what I say to people, and then I want to get to the second part of your question is, so my runway is short. That's basically what it is. And we always say, so there's two things we say. So you better be ready for the runway, and that's where I'm going to get to all of you. Or you extend your runway. And some of that is just buying some time from catastrophe. So that's how we think about how are we going to set it up. So it's not that climate change, is in a crisis in the sense of the world, in the sense that this seems like we're not solving this and this could end mankind. But how we address it is not through the tools of crisis management. You want to solve it as a public policy problem. The same thing is true of, say, homelessness. I mean, all of these things are crises in some sense, but they're different tools, than I would say. But that doesn't. So the tools that you have for the world that I'm in. So I'm a strong proponent in personal preparedness. And why is that? I mean, two reasons. One is things would be less bad for you. That's good. The other is the more that limited public resources are spent on, let's just be honest here, and I'm part of this community so I can say it, on communities that have the resources to fix problems, right? I mean, COVID was bad for us, but COVID probably wasn't as bad as it is for someone who lost their job, has no savings, and in the food line. So our obligation to those who will be impacted differently, because we know crises impact populations differently, elderly populations, minority populations, poor populations, as we saw with COVID, is our responsibility to ourselves. So let me just give you some factors. So I have a chapter on family unification. So what I know now, just to empower you, just to say I'm ready, that's a good thing, is your primary sentiment, I already know it now and I don't know any of you, is when a bad thing happens is family unification. It's like the universal. Right? It's absolutely the universal. If we can get family unification right, get people to their kids, how is my child is like the universal sentiment whenever anything bad happens. We are doing better. So think through sort of your communication, who is where. I grew up in California, in Los Angeles. This was just like part of and we didn't have cell phones then, like our standard operating procedure. If you couldn't get here, you got there. My parents were very focused on this because there was gonna be a big one, right? And so think about that. It takes 5 minutes. And as I said, like in the book, I said, I'm an 80% person. Like, I'm optimistic because I'm not a perfectionist. I'm gonna get you 80% of the way there. I'm not gonna be able to factor in every variable that you have a second home, you have whatever. Just spend a little time empowering yourself. How would you do that? The second is if you had to stay at home. This is now probably moot because most of you did have to stay at home. But if you wanted to know, like in a blizzard or whatever might be happening this weekend, what do I have at home? We call it 72 on you. I have 5 kids, I have 3 kids, a family of 5. 2 are now in college. So what does 72 on you mean? It means 72 hours, just be comfortable. Just make sure that you can be comfortable. That means for all of you, your medications, a second set of glasses, whatever it might be, see if you can in other words, extend your runway. And what does that mean for food? You can probably pretty much figure out. For water, it means I'm very precise when you ask a question. 1 gallon per person per day. So I have 15 gallons in my house, and I feel pretty comfortable with that. I mean, I don't even have 2 kids living in the house anymore. So that's all of you are going to go. So that's all you need. Just 1 gallon per person per day will cover you 3 days. We do not think. I mean, things would have had to been catastrophically bad to be more than 72 hours. And this is, you can give me the scenarios of that other 20%. The difference between preparedness and paranoia is an acceptance of imperfection. I'm just trying to fail safer, so that's it. Yes, in the back. Thank you.
Security is an almost infinitely
Okay, we're going to wait for the microphone for you. Here we go.
But Homeland Security is an almost infinitely broad subject.
Yes.
You have chosen to focus, and I don't quarrel with the focus, on what are relatively short-term events.
Yeah.
Accidents or individual acts. I'm concerned about what you might call creeping or growing threats to national security. One of them being the substantial and apparently growing number of people in this country who regard the current political system as illegitimate in many ways. Who believe that violence may be the appropriate response to those political ills, and who are consistently amassing the weapons through which potentially they could
make their views
Yeah.
known. My question is the U.S., in your view,
Yeah.
paying enough attention to this form of what has come to be called domestic
Terrorism. Yeah, and no, I'm glad you asked that. So I do view that, as the sort of the rising acceptance of the American population that violence is a natural extension of politics, right? And and so I try not to be political, but so I'm just going to be narrative here. But maybe my audience will approve. So it isn't that I don't think about that. I think about when that moment comes. So like say January 6th, which you're going to hear like, oh, it was a failure of imagination, a failure of planning. No. I mean, everyone on the outside, Donald Trump gave us the date, the time, and the motivation for what was going to happen on January 6th. Anyone who wasn't paying attention, who had authority, wasn't paying attention for a reason that had nothing to do with imagination. They were either afraid, they were biased, or whatever else. So I want to give the good news side of it, or at least the metrics I'm seeing now. So when January 6th happened and people like me were yelling at the rooftops beforehand, I do work with the Biden administration on Homeland Security issues. This is the Trump years. Remember, Trump had spent years on something that we called stochastic terrorism, which was these vague calls to violence, but he never really was specific, so he could have plausible deniability, right? Free Michigan. What do you mean by free Michigan when he tweets out free Michigan? Well, he can say, I just meant let Michigan not have to be mass. Well, of course, 16 guys try to kidnap the governor, right? This is like, they know what he's saying, right? So what happened over the years is, of course, the nurturing of this violence, which then becomes quite targeted after he loses the election. Time, place, motivation. Stop the steal is the motivation. Okay, so let's fast forward now. So what do you do on January 7th? Everything January 6th was a freaking nightmare, but January 7th, what do you do? How do you treat this? And this is where I do have familiarity with the boom. How do I make sure things are less bad so this thing doesn't grow? On January 10th, 2001, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic that got a lot of criticism, but I think because we don't know what we know now, but I think in hindsight, my use of language was correct. I said basically Trump is now the leader of a terror organization, and we have to treat this as a counterterrorism effort. And this is where this is the world I grew up in, right? I only became everything sort of after Hurricane Katrina when we realized we should look at more threats than terrorism. And what would that mean? That would mean proverbially decapitating its leader, get him off of social media, isolate him, make him a loser, right? Because terror organizations thrive. I know this is the world of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and the comparisons are not that far off. They thrive with the narrative of the win. When is ISIS most powerful? When it has land. Right? When it starts to lose land, it's hard to get men to recruit to die for what they would view as a losing cause, right? So you have got to get all of them to be viewed as losers. So it's Trump, it is the 800 or so going after the guys who were and the gals who were at the Capitol. So you go after leadership, you break up the organization. So Proud Boys and Oath Keepers are over. This is not to say that there aren't bad people with bad ideas still out there. It's just their capacity to organize violence. I'm more focused on the violence. I can't control all thought, right? I hate that these people exist, but you can make the violence harder. There's going to be incidents, and this morning I woke up to news about a Republican who was killed outside her home. The story seems complicated, so I won't say anything more, but is that a political hit job? We don't know. We certainly know what's going on with election people. So you do that consistently. So I'm against Facebook and Twitter putting Trump back online because I like the leadership being decapitated. And what we've seen, here's the good news because I have to end, what we've seen is that his ability, he may win the primary. I'm not saying that because there's going to be too many Republicans running against him, but his ability to get people to take up arms in his favor has been made less bad, I guess I would say. It is under the gun, so to speak. I can't believe I just said that, but it is hard for him to do that. So if you look at the January 6th anniversary rally at Mar-a-Lago, 14 people showed up. Why? Because most people do not want to go to jail for this guy anymore. They did when they thought that he was going to get them out of jail. And most people won't join Oath Keepers or Proud Boys, because why would I give to a bunch of losers who are going to be in jail for the next 20 years? So I am seeing some good metrics from the counterterrorism perspective, recognizing, you can't stop all bad things or bad motivations or bad people, but you can definitely make their impact less bad, I guess I would say. So I do have to let you all go. It's late. Thank you so much. I have to go too. But I want to thank you all for coming out. It's so great. Thank you. I have my purse. 1 gallon, 1 day per person.
Thank you so much.